Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today in our Moving Forward in Uncertain Times series. Today's topic is centered on your virtual presence and putting your best face forward. We'll be sharing some tips with you for online interviewing and working remotely. My name is Mallory Newby, and I'm a career coach in the University Career Center. So today, I'll be watching for your questions and comments in the Q&A column and adding those into the discussion. Also want to point out there will be a recording of today's presentation on our website. And if you're joining us, this is your first, we also have some others previously recorded that you can check out as well. So let's go ahead and meet today's presenter, Samantha Lamar. And Samantha is a graduate assistant for the career engagement team at the University Career Center. And I also want to recognize Sam because she also recently completed her master's degree, a master's in education with a focus on college student personnel. So congrats, Samantha, and we are excited to have you share your knowledge and information on today's topic.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mallory. And thank you all for taking a moment out of your day today to join us and chat through, some tips and tricks for virtual interviewing, as well as getting started remotely on a job. So as Mallory mentioned, I just finished my master's degree myself. So I went through a virtual interview process where I completed a phone interview. And then I will be starting my new job remotely. So I'm right there with you all. If you have any nerves or jitters, I'm in a similar situation. But I've worked for the Career Center the last 2 years and super excited to share some of this knowledge with you all today. So before we hop in, this is something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with and thinking about, but some things to consider when it comes to the job market that you're entering into as far as it concerns COVID-19 is that the hiring process is going to be slow. So anytime, even before coronavirus, we work with students and talk with them through the job search process. We always encourage them to practice resilience, to make lists of things that make them feel confident that they know are skills they bring to the table, because in any situation, job searching is a job in and of itself. So be prepared for a little bit of unpredictability. The people that you might be interviewing with might be getting new information every week themselves. So just go in with a positive attitude and a willingness to be flexible. This kind of ties into some of our previous workshops that we've done, especially Mallory's most recent one about career competencies. But it's really important that you understand how to identify your career competencies, your strengths and values, and skills so that you can relay those to employers, especially since you most likely will not be getting any kind of face time with an employer before actually accepting a position. And then this will be a thread throughout the entire presentation, but communication is more important than ever. So even those tiny things like a typo in an email or arriving a couple minutes late to a virtual meeting, those things employers will be paying even more attention to since they won't have the opportunity to meet you in person and have a handshake. So as you're preparing for your interview, some of these tips are things that we recommend for students, even again prior to COVID, but just some things to think about, especially as you're having virtual and phone interviews. So you definitely want to plan out your outfit and the location that you'll be conducting your interview at. So whether it's a phone or a video conference, I recommend that you dress in something that is comfortable but makes you feel confident, something that you would wear to an in-person interview. And the reason for this is, one, if it's a video conference, they will actually physically be seeing you, so you still want to dress to impress. But even though they won't be seeing you over the phone, dressing up makes you feel more confident. So as you've been going through quarantine, I don't know about you, but I know for me, sometimes I'm like, I'm just going to get dressed up and do my makeup. And you can tell the difference in how you feel when you do that versus not. So that can help with building your confidence. And then do your absolute best to find a quiet location with a strong technology connection. So I know there's different, barriers to this, but in particular for a quiet location, if you're able to communicate with anyone that you're living with, that you have an interview coming up and ask them, hey, you be quiet from 2 to 2:30. I'm going to be interviewing. And then with technology, if you're very concerned about your Wi-Fi connection, you may ask to switch a video conference interview to a phone interview if you don't think that your Wi-Fi will cooperate. Then this is, again, kind of a general tip that we give to students, but be sure to review the organization's website. So you want to do this so that you can write down some questions to have for the interviewers, but also just so you know, what have they been up to during this time. So I've seen a lot of different memes or things online talking about, ask people, how are they responding to COVID? How are you treating your employees during COVID? Well, I actually recommend that you do some of that research on your own. So of course, it won't all be readily available on the website, but maybe look ahead and see, for example, if we were interviewing someone with the University Career Center, they could look on our website and see that something new we've done during COVID is conduct these virtual workshops. And then, of course, you want to know the format and test out any of that technology beforehand. So when I say interview format, I mean, find out how many people are going to be interviewing you. What's the schedule for the day? You might have a first interview that's 30 minutes to an hour, and then another interview that's 2 to 3 hours. As you're getting everything set up, make sure that you're setting up your space to where you can make eye contact and really engage with the interviewers. And then test out any technology. So ask a trusted friend to test out any unfamiliar platforms. I know this is a ton of information, so we'll have time for questions here in a couple more slides. But if you have questions as I go through the content, feel free to put them in the chat, and Mallory will get those to me in a little bit. So now that you've prepped for the interview, during the actual interview, you want to be mindful of your airtime. So again, because you're not actually speaking with someone in person, it can be a little bit more difficult to gauge their body language as well as how receptive they are to what you're saying. So what I mean by this is that you want to make sure you're giving thorough and complete answers to all questions, but you don't want to ramble. And you want to be as clear and concise as possible. Also mute yourself whenever you're not speaking. This is a general etiquette tip, but do this to avoid feedback. So you don't want the employer to have any issues understanding you because they're receiving feedback from things they've said previously. Write down names. So this is actually part of the research that you can do before the interview as well. I recommend that you go to the website and you find the full list of the staff. So write down any names of people, if they've been mentioned to you beforehand that they'll be on the interview. That's a way to make sure that you don't get names wrong. So whenever people, if it's a panel interview, if there's 5 or 6 people, it's really easy when they're doing quick introductions to be like, oh, who was that? I didn't quite hear their name. So write those down so that you can address people by their first name when you're speaking to them. And if you're unsure who you're speaking to, just avoid using the name so you don't call someone by the wrong name. And it is okay to ask for clarification as well. So if an interviewer asks a question and you either don't know what they meant by it or you can't clearly understand them, it's completely fine to ask for clarification. And then this kind of goes into, again, that quiet setting. Make sure you're monitoring your surroundings. So especially if it's a video call, be mindful of your body language. So make sure even when they're speaking, you're looking directly into the camera, you're nodding, you're smiling, and you're just kind of sitting confidently and upright. And then be sure to make eye contact. So this is something that we were talking about in preparation for this, but we've all personally on the career engagement team been on interviews where people may have their camera angled below them. So you're actually looking down into the camera. So you don't want a setup like that. You want to be right at eye level, able to make eye contact with them through your webcam. Okay, just a couple other tips. So I recommend as well taking an important note per each interviewer. So what I mean by this is during your conversation, write down something that you connect with someone about. So maybe during your interview, you learn that someone who's interviewing you runs a program that you read about on the website that you think is really innovative and awesome. Or the person that will be your supervisor mentions that they really are hoping to launch this new initiative in the next 2 to 3 years. Write those things down. And then when it comes time to follow up after the interview, you'll have that information to make it a personalized follow-up. So we'll talk about what to do after the interview here in just a moment, but you want to make that as personable as possible. You don't want to just send a generic thank you. And then, of course, don't forget to listen. It can be really hard when you're being interviewed. You want to, keep the focus on yourself, of course. You will be doing the majority of the talking, but when you're not talking, don't allow yourself to get caught up in the thoughts in your head. Try to be as present as possible and listen to what others are saying. So that way you're not having to ask for too much reclarification of questions, and you might be able to pick up on important things that interviewers say that you can incorporate into your responses later on. This is most relevant for a longer interview, especially, or an interview that has any kind of presentation component. But if you're going to have a long pause, be sure to explain that. So if you need a moment to think about your response to a question, questions that are called behavioral questions, or where an employer might say, what would you do in this scenario? Or here's the situation, how would you respond? It's okay to take a moment to think of an example, but just be sure to communicate that to the interviewer so they don't think that you are frozen or lost a connection or anything like that. And then, of course, stay positive. So again, this goes for any kind of interview or interaction, but especially during COVID, you might find that interviewers start off the conversation with, how are you doing among, all the craziness that's going on, and try to keep it positive. So definitely have your friends that are your confidants and you can rant to or vent with if you're frustrated or scared. But during an interview process, be sure to keep it positive and say, it's definitely been a big change, but I'm really excited to be spending the afternoon with you, or something like that. And then, of course, be sure to ask thoughtful questions. So this is something that students ask about a lot in terms of should they be asking questions during the interview. So your questions actually communicate just as much about you as your answers to their questions do. So some examples of some questions you might ask would be, how has your company or your team innovated during COVID to respond to needs and customers? What will training and onboarding look like? So this is a great question, especially with all of the changes that are happening. Some states or some offices are starting to move back to working in person, but some are still remote. So find out what they think that might look like. And then one of my personal favorites to ask is just, how do you measure the success of the person that's in this position? So by asking this question, you're not only demonstrating that you're excited about the position, but also once you're in the position, you're dedicated to being successful and accomplishing the goals that are set forth for it. So those are just a couple examples. If you want help coming up with a few, I definitely recommend talking with your career coach about it as well. And then last but not least, treat the interview like a conversation. So I always gauge a successful interview by, at the end, we're kind of having more of a conversation back and forth. So again, you still want it to be professional. You want it to be focused on the job, but hopefully it goes from that kind of like stale question and answer vibe to a little bit more of a just conversational vibe. So now that you've completed the interview, first and foremost, of course, be sure that you're fully connected from your technology. This is a simple one and one that people probably don't need to know, but I just wanted to reiterate just in case, especially if it's on a webcam, make sure that you are, exited out of the platform that you were interviewing on and all of that, because you don't want to say or be seen doing anything that was not intended for the interviewers to see. So I also always recommend that you congratulate yourself and celebrate. So after you, especially for an introvert, after you finish with an interview, you might kind of have that energy crash of, oh my gosh, it's over. Take time to congratulate yourself. Even if you feel like you did poorly on an interview, you still took the time and the effort to apply for the position, to put your best foot and your best face forward. So congratulate yourself and take time to be proud of yourself for doing that and putting yourself out there. Then I also recommend that you reflect on what went well and what you might improve on in the future. So this is especially helpful for if for some reason the opportunity doesn't end up working out, then you'll have the information to go back on and think about, oh, okay, I didn't respond super well to the what are my strengths question, or I didn't have a good example of a weakness. It's just more information to help you improve in the future. And then, as I said, whether it goes well or not, you definitely want to follow up with everyone who interviewed you within the first 24 hours. So you can do this via a thank you email, a thank you card. I would definitely recommend email, especially right now with everything going on with Postal Service. Again, career coaches can sit down with you and help walk you through what an example of this might look like, but you want it to be personalized. You want it to be concise. You want to express your gratitude for their time and their energy given towards the hiring process. And then just be sure to continue to apply for positions after you finish the interview and thanked them. Even if you think it was the best, you're going to get the job. You are still a job seeker until HR paperwork is signed. And this is more important than ever, especially with COVID-19, because unfortunately, sometimes people are being offered positions and then it's having to be rescinded because of financial changes. So make sure you're continuing to put yourself out there and put in the work to get an opportunity.
It's great stuff, Samantha. Thank you for sharing those tips. We do have a few questions here. One is, what happens if like my internet connection is lost or I glitch during the interview? What do I do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So oftentimes whenever an employer is setting up a virtual interview, they will ask for a backup phone number for if this happens. If you're particularly nervous about your internet connection, like if you've had issues with it in the past, I recommend when you follow up with the employer and thank them for offering an interview, you say, I'm very excited to chat with you and the team. I do want to provide my phone number as a backup in case we have any connectivity issues.
Yes. Okay. Now this one is there a strategy to use to avoid rambling to answer those interview questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think practicing, so this can help you have an idea of what you want to say beforehand so you don't feel like you're just kind of winging it. I also personally like to write down my responses to questions that I think I might get, and that's a great way to think through them. And you can also, if it's not too much of a distraction and you're doing a webcam call, you could keep your phone up and have a timer, but that might be a little bit to manage.
Yeah, and one thing that I think sometimes too, just to add to that, is if it's a situational or a behavioral question, knowing what the STAR method is. And we're not really talking so much on interviewing, and we look to produce some content in that area, but look up the STAR method, and that's a framework to keep you on task with answering all parts of those questions. So all good tips. So this one is, you talked about the setup. How close should I be to my computer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I might actually, after this, test out and try to get an actual measurement, but I don't have anything too precise. But I would say you want it to be about your shoulders up. So you want to be about an arm's length from the actual monitor, I would say, maybe a little bit further, just so that your head and your shoulders are in the image, but that you can't see anything below that. And you're not just kind of like a head swimming in a background of whatever wall is behind you.
Definitely. This question is, so can I bring up COVID-19 if the interviewer doesn't? And so by that, slide mentioning COVID in terms of their company and protocols. If they don't mention that, is that a question that you could address?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think, especially if they don't mention it, you don't want your interview to be focused on it. It's something we all know that's happening right now. And while it is consuming much of our brain space and our lives, you want the interview to be focused on your skills, your abilities, and your strengths. I do think it is okay, though, especially in your questions, if you've prepared a question about, how are things changing with COVID at your company, or bringing it up. And, maybe a strength that you have is that you've done a really good job of balancing your classes remotely. And that will allow you to excel as a remote employee. So I think there's ways to bring it up that's appropriate, but you'll just want to balance it.
Excellent. And then the last question I have here is, how many questions should I ask at the end of the interview?
Ooh, another great question. So I would say 2 to 3. It depends on the length of the interview as well. So if it's like your final interview and you're meeting with multiple people, you might have more than 2 to 3, but at a minimum, I always recommend at least 2. And you don't want to do like 10 or anything like that.
Definitely. All right, I think that brings us to the last question that we had.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, I'm going to start to go into the portion of this presentation where we talk about getting started working remotely. So if you've already accepted a position and you're eager to start, but trying to figure out how to put your best foot forward, this is what the second half of our time together is going to cover. So the first 90 days, this is really the employer's opportunity to figure out, did we make the right decision? So whenever you get that phone call offering you a position, you're understandably super excited, should be proud of yourself, should take time to celebrate. But those first 90 days, again, you're being watched. They want to figure out, okay, is this person, delivering on the skills that they talked about in their interview? And it's also an opportunity for you. So this is your chance to ask a lot of questions. I think sometimes when people start a job, they're nervous to ask questions because they feel like they should know everything, or they don't want to come off as being the wrong choice for the employer or anything like that. But the first 90 days especially, that's your training time. So they're expecting questions, and asking questions is a great way to show that you're engaged and you care about the position. It's also an opportunity to start to build relationships. So again, if you're starting remotely, it might look a little bit different than how you would have built relationships before. But one of our previous student workers actually just started a remote position. And I was touching base with him a few weeks ago, and he mentioned that he did a virtual lunch with one of his coworkers. And that's a great example of a way to start to build those relationships, even though you can't meet in person. So the night before, it's kind of like those first day of school jitters. So even though you may have graduated from U of L, you still get that night before jittery feeling. So I always recommend that you evaluate what you need to be successful. So especially going into this environment, this might be your first time working remotely. So luckily you all have had experience figuring out what works best for you when it comes to being productive for school, but work is a little bit different. So determine what factors outside of work are going to allow you to thrive in this role. So do you have a mentor that you met at U of L that you can plan to touch base with at the end of your first week and just kind of process everything that you've experienced starting a job remotely? Do you have a sibling or a parent or a best friend or a partner that can really be there to help support you as you get started in this new job? And then also reflect on what excites you. So you may have accepted this position a couple months ago, actually, before COVID even was a thing in the United States. So reflect on what excited you. You might be feeling like you wish you could start in person, but you should still be excited. And there are a lot of things to be excited about. So why did you apply for the position in the first place? What skills and lessons do you want to learn from the opportunity? And then what knowledge do you bring? So was there a class that you took at U of L or a previous work experience that you feel like really prepares you to excel for this? And then this is my favorite. What are 3 words that you want your new team members or supervisor to describe you as? And I actually recommend, this is a little bit cheesy, but jotting these down on a Post-it note and maybe keeping them near your workspace so you can keep in mind, okay, I want my coworkers to view me as positive, helpful, and competent, or whatever your 3 words are, and you can just kind of keep those in mind as you get started. So just some logistical things kind of your night before. Of course, you want to get a good night's sleep, just like for the first day of school. Don't forget to set your alarm. Plan for a nice breakfast. So especially if you're feeling a little bit bummed that you're not going to be going to the office in person, maybe you can plan to wake up 20 minutes early and go get a coffee or go pick up breakfast from your favorite spot. Make sure that you're going to have all of your technology charged and ready the night before. So if you've already set up your email, make sure you can log in and that all is good with the password. Prepare your outfit. So again, this is a time to really act like you're going into the office, dress just as professionally as you did for the interview, and then set out anything else that you might need. So have a water bottle, notepad, all those sorts of things. And then practice some gratitude. So, now is a really exciting time to be starting a new position and a new opportunity. So just take some time to be proud of yourself for that. All right, so the first week, Even though you physically won't be arriving, you still want to be on time. So you may have a check-in meeting planned with your supervisor or your team. Definitely reach out to them beforehand if you don't hear a couple days at least before your first day to make sure what the expectation is. But you want to be there on time. So if they say, hey, let's meet at 9 a.m., you want to be there at 8:55. You don't want to arrive at 9:01. It's just as though you're going into the office. I've bolded this one because this is something you should do anytime you start a new job, but especially working remotely. Be sure to clarify expectations. So every single company, every single organization is doing different things right now when it comes to measuring employee success, tracking productivity. So figure out, do I need to be keeping a list of what I'm accomplishing each day? Do I need to check in with my boss every day at 11 a.m.? Find out what those norms are to make sure that you're adhering to them. And your supervisor more than likely will be communicating this to you already, but they're human too and might forget. So don't be afraid to ask a question about that. And again, like I've said throughout this whole presentation, ask plenty of questions and pay close attention to the culture. So your company's culture might be changing. It actually probably is. So however they would have described themselves maybe in the interview or before COVID might be totally different. So pay attention to, who's the person that everyone goes to ask for help, or who is the person that, always knows the most about this area. So that way you know who to go to when you need help with things yourself. Kind of figure out who the experts of the office are. And then avoid making any recommendations or changes when you're first starting out. This, of course, depends on the position that you're being hired for. But as a new person, you're going in with a fresh set of eyes. So you may come in with a lot of ideas or suggestions, but be sure to wait and really learn the culture and get familiar with the existing structures and practices before you try to implement anything new. And then as far as policies, you also want to make sure that you are aware of any HR policies that are related to the first 90 days of starting your position. So a lot of positions will have a policy that, at the end of the first 90 days, you sit down with your supervisor and they maybe have a conversation of, how things are going, if you'll be kept on the team, things like that. So I don't say that to scare you at all, because usually those first 90 days go perfectly fine and they're great. But many employers consider those first 90 days what's called a probationary period. So you may even ask your supervisor if those first 90 days look any different with COVID-19, because I'm wondering some employers might have extended those 90 days also to stretch into once you start in person. So what do you do after week one? It can be really exciting, but also challenging starting a new job, because your teammates kind of already have their workflow, right? So you're a new person to the team and they're trying to figure out, when should we incorporate them? What can they help with most? So after you've completed your training and really gotten comfortable, if you're 3 weeks to a month into your position, make sure that you're offering to help. So especially being remote, it's difficult for your teammates to learn how you like to communicate, what skills you can bring to the table. So if someone mentions during staff meeting that they're working on a project that you think sounds interesting or that you can contribute to, reach out to that person afterwards and offer to help, because from their perspective, they probably don't want to overwhelm you, or they may not know where you're at in your training. But from your perspective, you might feel like you have a little bit of extra time and you're excited to get started. Also, again, focus on building those relationships. So I mentioned the virtual lunch earlier, but over time, share some of your interests and make some common connections. So it can be really easy to just focus all on work, work, work. And this is something that as you learn the organization and your team's culture, you'll be able to distinguish, okay, what sorts of things do people talk about? Do I work with a bunch of runners, or do people like to cook? Can I share a recipe with my coworker or something like that? This is great for, building working relationships as well, because you'll have that rapport built, so you'll be able to help each other out. But it's also just a positive and a fun thing, right? So, you go to work, but you also want to be able to have trust and friendship with your colleagues as well. And then very important, always be available and on during your scheduled work hours. So even if something isn't blocked on your calendar or you don't have anything planned, you don't want to be making plans during the workday because you want to be available. You never know when your supervisor might reach out or need something, and those are the hours that you would normally be in the office, so you need to be present virtually as well. You also want to ask for and be open to feedback. So this is pre-COVID advice as well, but definitely during COVID-19, you want to be open to this. I recommend, within the first month or so of starting your job, communicate how you like to receive feedback from your supervisor. So this may be something that you've never thought about before. So maybe even sit down with yourself and spend a little bit of time reflecting on it. So are you okay with a supervisor that just kind of out of the blue mentions, oh, hey, I saw you made a little mistake on this. Would you mind to fix it? Or would you prefer more scheduled time for feedback so you can feel prepared for it and there can be more structure? So that's something that you might mention just to make sure they know how to best communicate with you. It's also good to ask about if there's any kind of structured feedback mechanism. So most employers will have some form of a mid-year review, something like that. So ask questions about what that'll look like. Maintaining boundaries. So this is more important than ever as well during COVID. You're working at your house. Before we had the luxury of, you go to work and then you come home and you're at your house. Well, now those two worlds are meshed a little bit. So it can be really challenging to figure out when to turn off, especially if you're working on a project and you're like, oh, I'm going to get 5 or 10 more minutes in. And when you start a new job, this is even more tempting because you want to make a good first impression. But just how you start a job is how you will continue to be in that job, right? So you don't want to set the precedent of working till 8 or 9 p.m. when you're paid to work until 5 p.m. So try to establish some kind of familiar spot in your living space that is where you work. So I know not everyone has their own office or even a desk, but maybe this certain spot that you sit on the couch is where you always do your work, or you do your work on the back patio and no work is allowed in your bedroom or something like that. And then try to develop a ritual or habit that kind of mentally signals the end of your workday. So maybe if you have a pet, I have a dog, for example, walking her at the end of my workday every day to say, okay, it's time for her walk. My day's over. Maybe you watch a TV show or listen to a podcast or go for a run. Or maybe when dinner time comes around, when you cook dinner, no work after that. And then, of course, you want to complete your tasks on time or early. This goes back to what I mentioned earlier about this is the opportunity for the employer to make sure they made the right decision, as well as for you to showcase that you are eager to be there and going to be a contributing member of the team. So deliver on your promises. This will also allow you to be assigned more tasks and greater responsibility. So when you're starting out in your career, you might be thinking about, how can I move up? I know I want to be here in 10 years. Well, the best way to be where you want to be in 10 years is to show up where you're at and give it your all. So avoid overcommitting yourself. Sometimes when you're starting a new job, it can be exciting and you want to help with 15 different things, but focus on just a couple things so you can deliver on those promises. All right.
That was such great information, such good advice. This is also challenging, and this question is kind of about the social aspect of that. So how would you advise, or is it okay to ask about, social activities with coworkers during my first week on the job? So can I ask to do like a happy hour, or how do I get to know my coworkers outside of work?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So I think it depends on the work culture. Of course, it's a little bit of an intuitive thing that you, once you're on a team, you'll get to see who is the really social person that always plans those things. When it comes to if you should initiate those, I think it's completely appropriate to reach out to a coworker and ask if they want to do a virtual lunch. Maybe mention, hey, I was looking at your calendar. I see you're available Tuesday at 11. I always eat lunch at that time. Would you want to do a virtual lunch? I personally would not recommend initiating a virtual happy hour just because you don't know the company culture around drinking. Not that a virtual happy hour necessarily has to mean that, but it kind of insinuates it. So you don't want to initiate that. You would want that to come from someone higher up.
Definitely. I think the lunch and kind of keeping that within the business environment is a good idea. I don't think we have any other questions. I really think you did an excellent job in covering all of the different aspects of this new, in different workspace. So that looks like all the questions that we have. And if you have any other questions, please let us know. I know Sam wants to point out some additional resources and share some stuff with you.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you all. And I should have said this at the beginning, but there's so many resources out there on topics like this. A lot of my information I got from the Muse, which is a really helpful career resource. But I encourage you to schedule an appointment with your career coach, especially if you have an interview coming up or if you're job searching. We're here to help with that. We have daily job postings being posted on Handshake. We can also walk you through how to use LinkedIn to search for jobs. There are virtual workshop recordings like this one that are on our website. So if you want to revisit this later or see some of our other topics, I encourage you to check those out. And we have lots of other resources for helping you figure out how to write a resume. I really recommend submitting to our document drop program, which can be found on our website as well. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I'll hang out for a couple more minutes if you have any other questions, but feel free to contact me at my email address listed there as well.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Samantha. This has been excellent. And I know that we have a lot of students that are looking for jobs and getting still interviews. And so this is very, very helpful. We encourage you to share it. If you know of any of your classmates or your friends that have an upcoming interview, feel free to share this. You'll have a link and you can access that on our website. So it looks like we might have... Nope, that was our last question. So we'll sign out and thank you all for joining us. And next week we have a workshop on job searching. So we'll get more in depth about how to navigate that process within the new climate that we're in. And so that will be on next Wednesday, the 20th. At noon. So register for that on Handshake and we'll see you then. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.